In this section of the lecture, I want to give you my perspective on why study of the history of economic development is so valuable and important. There's two reasons, I think. First of all is that economic development matters for human well-being. Secondly, that we can only really understand economic development by adopting an historical perspective. I'm going to address those 2 points in turn in the rest of this section of the lecture. First of all, the point that economic development matters for human well-being. I'm going to take two approaches to talking about this particular point. The first approach is to make the point that economic development matters hugely for the types of lives that people in different countries around the world can live. In this graph, I've taken data from the United Nations 2011 Human Development Report, and I've presented data on the value of economic output per person for 10 countries that the United Nations rates as having a low level of development, and 10 countries the United Nations rates as having a high level of economic development. From the 20 countries I've chosen, you can see that at the top we've got Singapore, which had average value of economic output in 2011 of $52,000, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which had average value of economic output per person of $280. So that's just 1/187th in Democratic Republic of Congo compared to Singapore. My point is that this difference in the amount of economic output, the level of economic development in, for example, Singapore and the Democratic Republic of Congo matters a huge amount for the types of lives that people in those two countries live. First of all, if we think about how long people live for. So here I've presented data from 2011 on life expectancy in Singapore and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So you can see in Singapore, 81.8 years, Democratic Republic of Congo, 48.4 years. So just by the accident of whether you're born in Democratic Republic of Congo or Singapore, you could be living half as long or twice as long. And the relation to economic development is that we know that in countries which are richer, it's less likely that there'll be shortages of food, less likely there'll be famines, less likely there'll be disease epidemics, there's a higher quality of health care available, medical care when people do become ill. And this affects the likelihood of mortality, especially during infancy, and then translates into a much higher eventual life expectancy in the rich country Singapore than the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are other aspects of life that are affected by economic development as well. Another example would be literacy, the likelihood that people in the population are literate. So here I've got data for Singapore and again the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2010 that show that in Singapore basically the literacy is pretty much universal, 96% literacy rate. Whereas in the Democratic Republic of Congo only 67%. And so again, that's likely to be related to economic development in terms of the opportunities that people have in the different countries for attending education, whether educational institutions even exist. Now, here I'm making the assumption or the linkage that it's economic development that's driving health outcomes and literacy outcomes. And I think it's absolutely correct that there is that causal linkage. Of course, it's also likely that causality runs the other way, that in countries where people are healthier, they're likely to be able to be more economically active, or in countries where people are more literate, they bring a higher level of skills to economic activity, and so literacy and health are likely to drive economic activity to some degree as well. But also it's the case, as I'm describing here, that we'd expect the level of economic development to be a significant driver of life expectancy, of literacy, and of other indicators of well-being. The other way in which economic development matters for human well-being that I want to talk about is through the effect on geopolitics. So, for example, at the moment, you're probably aware, there's a large amount of discussion of China's rise as an economic power and concern about the implications that that might have for international relations. And there's really sort of two implicit assumptions in that discussion about China. One is that power follows economic development, that China's role in the world is likely to increase, its ability to influence global political outcomes is likely to increase as it becomes a richer country. But also a second assumption that periods of transition in the country which is the richest, the largest country economically, can be periods of instability in economic relations. So economic development matters for human well-being in the sense that it matters for geopolitics in terms of the distribution of power and also the stability of international relations. This is a point that the historian Paul Kennedy makes in his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, where he says the historical records suggest that there is a very clear connection in the long run between an individual great power's economic rise and fall and its growth and decline as a military power. For two reasons. First of all, economic resources are necessary to support a large-scale military establishment. And as far as the international system is concerned, wealth and power are always relative. So it's about the relative size of economies mattering for their relative geopolitical influence. The other way in which I want to talk about the study of the history of economic development mattering, being valuable, is that to get a proper perspective on economic development, a proper understanding of economic development, you really need to take a historical perspective. So when we think about the fact that Singapore and Singapore's a rich country today, Democratic Republic of Congo is a poor country today, that's not a situation that just happened overnight. That's a situation that's evolved over several centuries. And so if we're going to understand why it is that Singapore's a rich country and or how it is that Singapore came to be a rich country, how it is that Democratic Republic of Congo came to be a poor country today, we can only really do that by studying the path in history by which Singapore came to be rich and Democratic Republic of Congo came to be poor. In other words, we need history to understand why things are the way they are today. Now, as we track out the path by which Singapore became rich, the path by which Democratic Republic of Congo became poor, we learn about causal linkages. We learn about what are the factors that made Singapore rich, that made the Democratic Republic of Congo poor. And so that introduces the idea of learning from history, the idea that by knowing about the causal linkages that have caused countries to become rich and poor, we may learn information which is valuable for influencing economic development in the future. For example, policymakers may learn from understanding why Singapore has been successful economically about policy measures or approaches they could adopt to try to assist poor countries develop in the future. So what I'm saying here is that I think there's sort of two perspectives to thinking about sort of the value of history. One is we can only understand how things came to be the way they are today by having a historical view. And secondly, out of that historical view, we can develop lessons from history. We can understand more about causal linkages, or in this particular case, the drivers of economic development. And that may be useful for us in the future in assisting economic development in poorer countries. Of course, it's very important to take a cautious approach to think about learning from history. First of all, the idea of knowing exactly what history was is sometimes or often problematic. And then secondly, the idea of applying that knowledge about history to the future is also a difficult exercise. We know that history never repeats, so we can never simply apply what happened in the past and think that that's going to happen again in the future. So we've got to get the balance right. On the one hand, there are things we can learn, but we need to take a cautious approach. This is something that I think is expressed very nicely by the economic historian J.L. Anderson, who says, prediction in the sense of precise description of future events is not possible. However, forecasting is. The more guesses about future events are informed by a knowledge of why things are as they are and what forces tend to bring about changes, the more accurate are our guesses likely to be. A necessary element of that knowledge, why things are the way they are, what forces tend to bring about change, is an understanding of how and why events occurred in the past. So Anderson's taking sort of a nicely nuanced approach here. He's saying, look, we've got to try and forecast what's going to happen in the future and how we can influence that. On the one hand, we have to be cautious because we know that we can never exactly predict future events, but we still have to do it, and we're going to be able to do it better if we have a knowledge of history. I want to finish up by giving sort of two particular examples of learning from history. The first example is about the episode of the global financial crisis in the 2000s. So when this event struck in sort of 2007 and 2008, it didn't take long for economists and policymakers to start drawing parallels with previous events. And in particular, the big parallel they drew with the global financial crisis was with the Great Depression of the late 1920s and primarily 1930s. And they drew two lessons from the episode of the Great Depression. One lesson was about how severe, how really bad an economic downturn could get if there was no intervention by government policymakers to deal with it. And secondly, that you couldn't necessarily expect the capitalist market-based system to correct itself, to bring it out of that downturn without government playing or policymakers playing a role. And I think you can see the application of those lessons in what happened in the global financial crisis. So on this graph here, what I've shown is in world industrial output. And I've created an index of world industrial output from the Great Depression and the global financial crisis. And this index, which is 100 at the starting point of the Great Depression and what you might take as the starting point of the global financial crisis. And so then with months being on the horizontal axis, you can see that for about a year after the onset of the Great Depression and the onset of the global financial crisis, that the path of world industrial output is relatively similar, sort of falling by a little bit over 10% in both episodes. But in the Great Depression, that decline continues. So you can see out to about 2 years, after about 2 years, world industrial output's fallen about 15-20% more, so that it's down 30% from its peak. Whereas in the global financial crisis, after 12 months, world industrial output reverses and begins to increase again. Why did world industrial output evolve differently in the Great Depression compared to the global financial crisis? Well, I'd argue that a major reason was the approach taken by economic policymakers. In the global financial crisis, policymakers took a much stronger approach of trying to stimulate economic activity, to add to the amount of economic activity occurring, than was the case in the Great Depression. A major way in which they did that was by using their budget policy. And on this graph, I've shown budget policy in the Great Depression and in the global financial crisis. What's being measured here is a measure of the government budget surplus. And so if the number is here above zero, that's a positive, and that means that the government is running a surplus. That means that its expenditure is less than the revenue it's collecting from the economy. So in other words, if the government is running a surplus, that means it's subtracting or reducing the level of economic activity that's occurring. Down here with a negative number, that's a deficit. What that means is that the government is actually spending more than it is collecting, for example, in the form of tax revenue from the economy. So in this case, because the government's spending more than it's collecting or taking in from the economy, the government's having a net positive effect on economic activity. It's adding to or stimulating the amount of economic activity. Now, the blue line here starts in 1925, so we can think of sort of after 4 years being the start of the Great Depression, and similarly the purple line starts in 2004, so the global financial crisis started in 2008, so we can think of sort of the 4-year point as being the critical point for thinking about what policymakers did when the Great Depression and the global financial crisis commenced. And you can see that what happens immediately in the global financial crisis is that the amount of budget deficit increases as a percentage of GDP. So in other words, policymakers immediately within a couple of years reduced taxes, increased the amount they were spending or contributing to economic activity. And so that had a major effect in the countries where it happened of stimulating the amount of economic activity, causing world industrial output to reverse its downward trend and pick up and begin to increase again. Whereas you can see in the Great Depression sort of the some sort of very slight movement towards deficit, but sort of very, very slight. It's really only after 3 years, getting towards the end of the the worst period of the Great Depression, that government budget deficits start to increase, and there starts to be a net stimulatory effect of government spending. So one way of interpreting what happened in the global financial crisis in this sort of immediate stages of it is that governments and policymakers had learned the lessons from the Great Depression of how severe economic downturns could be. They had the benefit of economic theory developed by John Maynard Keynes in the aftermath of the Great Depression, which they could use to guide them in setting economic policy in a way that would reverse the downturn that was occurring much quickly than would otherwise have occurred. The second example of learning from history that I want to use is the Kony 2012 campaign. So in 2012, the organisation Invisible Children started a campaign to have Joseph Kony, a commander with the Lord's Resistance Army fighting in northern Uganda, captured and taken before the International Criminal Court for crimes that he'd committed. Now, this became a major world event, the Kony 2012 campaign. There was a lot of criticism of Invisible Children, a lot of which was probably misplaced. I want to ask a different question to any questions that I saw being asked at the time about the Kony 2012 campaign. I want to ask what is achieved by capturing and imprisoning someone like Joseph Kony for economic development in a country like Uganda. Now, I need to say when I ask this question that I'm not saying that we don't need to have principles of justice that can be applied to punish people who've committed heinous crimes like Joseph Kony is accused of having committed. But what I do want to ask is, what effect would it have on economic development in a country or region like Uganda if Joseph Kony was to be taken out of the country and imprisoned? Now, one view is that this would lead to a transformation in economic development in Uganda. It's what I think of as being the bad person fallacy in history. The idea that bad things like low levels of economic development happen because bad people are involved. Bad people are preventing good things that otherwise would have happened to occur, or are causing sort of bad things to occur. It's not, and I guess this is why I call it a fallacy, an approach that I subscribe to. I guess my view is that in different countries around the world, there's probably pretty much a similar proportion of good people and bad people, if we can use those terms, and that what distinguishes, therefore, a country like Uganda from richer countries is not so much that they have a disproportionate number of bad people, but rather there are other aspects of the country that mean that bad people can be particularly influential in those countries. So if we take the case of Uganda, Uganda is a country that lacks a strong central state and has been racked by civil war for many years. And so it's the circumstances in Uganda, I would argue, rather than the existence of particular bad people, that is the source of Uganda being a relatively poor and troubled country. If we want to understand why Uganda lacks a strong central state and is racked by civil war, then we really need to look at things like Uganda's history, the history of sort of being a British colony, the way Britain managed the transition from colonialism to independence, the ethnic fractionalisation in Uganda, the fact that Uganda, being in Africa where it is part of a region of instability. So if we think about improving economic development, improving standards of living in Uganda, my argument is that it's not so valuable to be removing individual people we might think of as bad. We need to sort of look a lot more at the deep structures which are allowing people like Joseph Kony to have the influence they do in those countries. And so I'd say we learn several lessons about the value of history from thinking about Kony 2012 and Uganda. One lesson is that the sources of economic development are complex, and there's a multiplicity of them. And we need to recognise that if we're going to try and think about countries being rich and poor. Second point is that history can often give us a structure for thinking about those different causes. For example, as I've tried to explain, if you think about sort of the history of economic development in Uganda, you get the idea that what's happening is that it's political and institutional factors which are creating the opportunity through the existence of civil war and the absence of strong states for individuals to have an influence, an adverse influence on economic outcomes and standards of living in a country like Uganda. The other thing you realise when you start to think about the example of a particular country is, and to realise that you need to understand the history of that country to understand its economic development, is that we really need to sort of take a case study type approach very often to understanding about economic development. Because the history of each country is different, we need to think about the economic development experience of each country individually if we're really going to understand its experiences properly. In the next section of this lecture, I'm going to go on to talk about the way that we'll think about measuring economic development during this course.